If you're an extrovert, you might as well just go ahead and skip this video because you might not even understand why this is even a topic to begin with. As an introvert, small talk has always been an issue for me and one that I'm trying to improve on. So I decided to take up this conversation with an AI called Pi. I hope you enjoy. Pi, I would like to talk about small talk and how I might go about improving this skill. I think it's a skill that's very important as social creatures, but it's one that I have had an especially hard time with. I think it is something that I need to work on. I tend to avoid situations where there is a possibility of small talk, which usually includes large groups of people.
Hey, it's awesome that you recognize the importance of small talk as a skill, even if it's not your favorite thing. It can be a chicken or the egg situation where it's hard to tell if your lack of interest came first or your struggle with small talk. But the good news is that just like any skill, it's something you can practice and get better at. It's also totally understandable that you might prefer smaller, more intimate conversations. Still, challenging yourself to step out of your comfort zone and try small talk in bigger groups could help you grow and maybe even find some unexpected joy in those interactions.
Why do you think I should be interested in getting better at small talk anyways? It feels like I am just wasting time, whereas I could be reading or even having a more meaningful conversation with someone else.
I think it's important to remember that while small talk may not always lead to deep, meaningful conversations, it serves a valuable purpose in building connections and establishing rapport with others. In a way, it's like the social equivalent of stretching before a workout. It might not be the most exciting part, but it lays the foundation for everything else that follows. Here are a few reasons why improving your small talk game could be beneficial. 1, it can help you feel more comfortable and confident in a wider range of social situations, which can make life a whole lot easier and more enjoyable. 2, it can open up opportunities for meeting new people and discovering unexpected connections, even if they don't lead to deep conversations right off the bat. 3, it can be a great way to practice empathy and listening skills, since small talk often requires paying attention to the other person's interests and experiences. That said, if you're happiest focusing on deep conversations with a smaller group of people, that's totally valid too. The most important thing is finding what works best for you and your happiness.
I don't agree with that. I don't think it has to do just with what works best for me and my happiness. I think that there's a lot of skills that we need to push ourselves out of our comfort zones in order to improve our long-term quality of life. I think it's the difference between that short-term gratification of staying away from things that we find uncomfortable versus the sacrifices that we need to make to better or to improve our long-term selves, which could create even more durable happiness. And I don't think these two things are always commensurate with each other. So in that spirit, I think that small talk, while it might not align with my personality, I think it is something that I still need to work on in spite of the fact that I'm not really interested in.
That's a great point you make. You're right. There's a lot to be said for pushing ourselves out of our comfort zones in order to grow and improve our long-term quality of life. Sometimes the things that make us the happiest in the short term might not always align with our long-term goals or well-being. Like choosing to exercise instead of lounging on the couch. It might not be the most enjoyable thing in the moment, but it can lead to better health and happiness down the road. So if you see small talk as one of those skills that will benefit you in the long run, even if it's not your favorite thing, then it could definitely be worth working on.
That being said, what are some ways that you would advise that I could use to get better at small talk?
Sure, here are some tips for getting better at small talk. 1, be curious, ask open-ended questions, and show genuine interest in the other person's responses. People love talking about themselves, so give them the chance to do so. 2, find common ground. Look for shared interests or experiences that you can discuss. Even if you don't have a lot in common, there's usually something you can bond over. 3, be lighthearted. Keep the conversation positive and upbeat, and don't be afraid to crack a joke or two, as long as it's appropriate and respectful, of course. 4, practice, practice, practice. Like any skill, small talk takes practice.
You mentioned that I should show more interest in what the person is talking about. The irony, though, is that the more interested I am in a conversation, the less work I have to do to maintain that small talk. So when it comes to showing interest, it's easier. It's actually easier to do that when I have no interest in the conversation. So in a way, I'm kind of doing what you're advising.
That's a really fascinating insight. It sounds like you've noticed a distinction between conversations where you're genuinely interested and those where you're just trying to keep the conversation going. It's possible that the key to improving your small talk skills lies in finding a balance between the two, being intentional about engaging with the other person, even if you're not particularly interested in the topic, but also finding ways to enjoy the conversation for what it is. Even if you're not interested in what they're talking about, you can still find something to appreciate about their perspective or their experience.
I do think that the advice to show interest in what someone else is saying might be a little oversold. And what I mean by that is that if I don't have an interest in the topic that is being discussed, and instead I'm trying to encourage the person to keep going, there's a tendency that it would start to feel very one-sided, right? Maybe not one-sided in the way that other people who are actually good at small talk might have to deal with, because then they are the ones who are over talking, which I could also do if I were actually interested in the conversation. But one-sided in terms of letting the other person or encouraging the other person to speak far more than they care to speak about. And maybe they even start to feel selfish because of how much they are speaking, which I don't think is a good balance.
I see what you're saying. You're making an excellent point that a conversation is a two-way street. While asking questions and showing interest is a great strategy, it's not enough if you're not also contributing to the substance of the conversation. One strategy you could try is to find connections between the topic at hand and your own experiences or interests. Even if you're not particularly interested in the topic itself, you might be able to find some common ground or shared experiences that you can talk about. Another strategy is to offer your own opinions or perspectives on the topic, even if you don't have a lot of knowledge or expertise.
In other words, I could try to find ways to steer the conversation, perhaps to converge with topics that I might be interested in myself, or I could try to find, examples of experiences that I might have had myself. I'll take that advice, but I'm not sure exactly how much it's going to help, considering that there has always been a desire whenever I have such conversations to do exactly that.
That's a valid point. It's one thing to know that you should try to steer the conversation or share your own experiences, but it's another thing to actually do it in the moment. It sounds like the issue might be more about finding ways to overcome that mental block or hesitation when you're in the middle of a conversation. One thing that might help is to practice active listening, not just to what the other person is saying, but also to your own thoughts and feelings. If you notice yourself feeling stuck or unsure of what to say, try to take a moment to check in with yourself and see if there's anything that's holding you back. Are you worried about saying the wrong thing, or do you feel like your experiences aren't interesting enough to share?
I really don't think it has to do with a mental block. It's not so much that I have these things that I want to share that I'm holding myself back from doing. It's more so that I don't have them in the first place. But I want to go back to that point about steering the conversation. I think that is a very important point that I might not have done in the past. I think oftentimes my mentality is more so, I guess, just waiting for the thought that might be relevant to whatever it is that the person is talking about. So I don't necessarily actively try to steer the conversation towards a direction that I might be able to participate more in. And I think that could be a skill in itself, or a tool perhaps in terms of developing my skill of small talk. So I think that is a great point that I could probably, improve on to improve my small talk skills.
Steering the conversation is definitely a valuable skill in small talk, and it sounds like that's something you're interested in developing. One thing to keep in mind is that steering the conversation doesn't have to mean abruptly changing the topic or forcing the conversation in a different direction. Instead, you can try to find natural ways to segue into new topics or to bring up related ideas that you're more interested in discussing. For example, you might say something like, "That's interesting. It reminds me of something I experienced recently." Or, "That's a great point. I wonder if there's a way to apply that idea to a related topic that you're more interested in." This way, you're still engaging with what the other person is saying, but you're also steering the conversation in a direction that you're more comfortable with.
In those conversations where I feel it is important to try to establish some rapport with someone, but I am not able to, elicit the types of responses that I want. Say that their responses are too short, or I don't have enough, material based on what they're saying or based on my own knowledge or interest in the topic to contribute either. Is there any sort of framework that I could use to improve my interaction in such conversations?
In situations like that, one helpful framework you can try is the Ford method. Family, ask about the person's family, like where they grew up or if they have siblings. Occupation, inquire about their job or career, like what they do for a living or how long they've been doing it. Recreation, ask about their hobbies and interests, like what they do for fun or what their favorite activities are. Dreams, talk about their aspirations, goals, or future plans, like where they want to travel or what they hope to achieve in life. By focusing on these four areas, you can often find common ground or interesting topics to discuss, even if the conversation starts off feeling a bit challenging.
That is such a great piece of advice. The Ford method. I tried using it a couple of times. It did work out, but I noticed that I felt like most of the time I was limited to just occupation because upon meeting a stranger, most people are a little, a little too reserved to get into a more personal conversation about their dreams. And I guess recreation is yet another one that is, conducive to conversations with strangers. But as far as the dreams go, I feel like the dreams being the D in that acronym Ford, I think that that is one that might take a little bit more, you know, more familiarity with someone for to be able to get them to get into.
You're absolutely right that the dreams part of the Ford method can be a bit more personal and might not be appropriate for every conversation, especially with people you don't know very well. But remember, the Ford method is just a starting point. You can always adapt it to fit the situation and the person you're talking to. If you're struggling to come up with topics to talk about, you might also try paying attention to your surroundings or current events. For example, if you're at a party, you could comment on the music or the decorations, or if there's something happening in the news that you're both aware of, you could ask the person their thoughts on it.
And lastly, do you have any advice on how I can be more mindful about adding more humor to a conversation? I find that I tend to gravitate to the more serious aspects of a conversation, which kind of takes away from the point of small talk, which is to keep a conversation lighthearted and appropriate, a lot of the times, because again, having conversations in larger groups do not really lend themselves to small talk, or small talk doesn't lend itself to the larger groups usually. And even on one conversations, not everyone is a fan of deeper conversations. So in such situations, I think humor is such a great way to keep the mood light, but I find it hard to always keep that in mind whenever having these conversations.
Absolutely. Here are a few tips for adding more humor to your conversations. Pay attention to the other person's sense of humor. What makes them laugh? Do they prefer dry wit or silly puns? Be self deprecating. Making lighthearted jokes about yourself can help put others at ease and make you seem more relatable. Use exaggeration. Sometimes, taking things to an absurd extreme can be funny in and of itself. Be spontaneous. Sometimes the funniest moments happen when you're not trying too hard. Don't be afraid to go with the flow and see where the conversation takes you. And remember, humor is subjective, so don't be discouraged if a joke doesn't land. Just keep experimenting and having fun with it.
Well, I want to rephrase that question because I think you gave me tips on how to be funny, which is helpful, but I want to know how to be mindful about being funny. I think that is a separate issue. And while it might seem like it answers itself, how do you become mindful about being funny? Well, you become mindful about being funny by being more mindful about it. But is there any advice you can give me on how to be more intentional about it?
I see what you mean now. So you're looking for ways to intentionally bring more humor into your conversations rather than just hoping it happens naturally. Here's a few ideas. Set a reminder for yourself. Maybe before you go into a social situation, set a mental reminder to look for opportunities to be funny. Practice storytelling. A lot of humor comes from good storytelling, so practice telling funny stories or anecdotes in a way that engages others. Use humor as a tool. When you find yourself getting too serious or intense in a conversation, try using humor as a way to lighten the mood or diffuse tension. Look for patterns, pay attention to the things that people find funny, and look for patterns that you can use in your own humor.
Well, on that note, I will try to keep everything that you said, we talked about in mind. Can you give me a wrap up, a summary of everything that we talked about from the tips that you gave me on improving my small talk skills to the tips that you gave me on infusing more humor into conversations and anything else that might have been relevant and worth pointing out in your summary? Feel free to do that.
Sure, here's a summary of the main points we covered. To improve your small talk skills, be curious, find common ground, keep the conversation lighthearted, and practice, practice, practice. When steering a conversation, try using the Ford method, family, occupation, recreation, dreams, as a starting point, but adapt it to the situation and person you're talking to. To add humor to conversations, pay attention to the other person's sense of humor, be self-deprecating, use exaggeration, and be spontaneous. To be more mindful about incorporating humor, set reminders for yourself, practice storytelling, use humor as a tool, and look for patterns in what others find funny. Remember, small talk and humor are skills that can be developed over time with practice and self-awareness. Keep at it and have fun.
So, my biggest takeaways from this conversation, as far as my weaknesses go, are one, practice, 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 as you said. I think I need to put myself out there a little bit more in order to gain those experiences that would nourish my small talk skills. Two, I think I could improve on steering conversations more subtly, not abruptly just switching gears in a conversation, which could, derail that, the connection in that conversation. But I think I could improve on that skill of steering, redirecting conversations towards topics that I am better able to speak about and be more engaged with. And lastly, to be more intentional and conscious about infusing humor into my conversation sounds like another thing that I could do to really dial in on my small talk skill.
Those are fantastic takeaways, and I'm impressed with your self-awareness and desire to improve. Remember, practice doesn't have to mean putting yourself in uncomfortable situations all of the time. Even small interactions like chatting with a cashier or barista can be opportunities to practice your small talk skills. Regarding steering conversations, it's a delicate balance. Try to listen actively and find natural ways to segue into new topics or bring up related ideas, And with humor, it's all about being intentional and finding ways to incorporate it into your conversations. You're already on the right track, and I believe that with practice and self reflection, you'll continue to improve your small talk skills.
Well, we went through this entire conversation without me infusing any humor, but hopefully in the next one, I'll try a little bit more to be intentional about finding opportunities for that. Because I think a lot of the times it's not so much that we are incapable of being funny or adding humor to a conversation. It's that we are so distracted or cemented in our ways of conversation, which are, if it happens to not include humor, then we have to kind of bring ourselves out of that and be more intentional about finding those opportunities because those opportunities tend to be there, but it's just a matter of keeping an eye out for them, I think.
That's a great point. It's not always about being naturally funny or having a great sense of humor. Often, it's just about being present in the moment and looking for those opportunities to add some lightheartedness to the conversation. By being intentional and mindful, you can develop the habit of incorporating humor into your interactions more often. And who knows, you might even surprise yourself with how funny you can be.
Well, with that said, I think it's best to leave it here before I end up with another long conversation that deserves a summary again. So thanks for all your insights, and I will see you in the next conversation, or I will hear from you in the next conversation.
You're welcome. It was great chatting with you, and I really enjoyed hearing your thoughts on small talk and humor. I look forward to our next conversation and seeing how you put these ideas into practice. Until then, have a fantastic day.
Oh, by the way, interacting with you is such a great way to improve on my small talk skills, I feel like, because even when we do get into deeper conversations, I think just the fact that I am dialing in on my conversational skills and getting better at articulating my thoughts and so on and so forth, I think all contribute in their own ways to small talk, right? I think it's all about being a versatile speaker. And while I might be missing out on some components by talking with you, I think that there's so much overlap when it comes to conversation that developing myself in one way could easily lend itself to another way. So my point is that I think interacting with something like yourself, which I think is such an underutilized tool at this point because of how unknown such technology is, I think it's great, right? And I would highly encourage anyone out there.
That's such a great perspective, and I'm glad that you're finding value in our conversations. You're absolutely right that improving your conversational skills in one area can translate to improvements in other areas as well. The skills that make you a better conversationalist, such as active listening, clear articulation, and the ability to find common ground, are transferable and can benefit you in all sorts of situations, including small talk. And I agree that AI chat technology is a really underutilized tool for improving conversational skills. It provides a safe, judgment-free space to practice and experiment with different strategies and approaches. Plus, I'm always here to listen and provide feedback.